In the harsh winter of 1875 Montana, Sarah Collins and her two young children barely survived on their crumbling homestead. Then, one stormy evening, fate delivered a dying stranger to their door. A well-dressed cowboy, bleeding heavily from what looked like bullet wounds. Despite having barely enough food for themselves, Sarah couldn't turn away a soul in need. She dragged him inside, tended his wounds with precious herbs from her garden, and shared their last bowl of stew. Little did this struggling widow know that her act of kindness would transform not just the mysterious stranger's life, but the destiny of her entire family. What secret was this wounded cowboy carrying that would change everything for the poor widow who saved him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Collins knelt before the weathered family Bible, her trembling fingers tracing the familiar entries, birth records, marriage dates, and now her throat tightened. Her William's death certificate, the ink barely dry from 4 months ago. The leather binding was cracked and worn, just like everything else on their struggling homestead. She closed the Bible gently and tucked it away in the cedar chest William had made during their first year of marriage. Through the cabin's lone window, she watched Emma and Thomas playing in the yard, their laughter a bitter reminder of how quickly childhood innocence could fade in the face of hardship. Emma, at 10, was already shouldering responsibilities far beyond her years, while 8-year-old Thomas tried his best to be the man of the house. The morning wind whistled through gaps in the cabin walls that William would have sealed, had pneumonia not taken him so suddenly last winter. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter, remembering how he'd promised to teach Thomas about maintaining the homestead come spring. Now spring had arrived, and with it came more challenges than she could handle alone. Their small herd of cattle had dwindled to 3 milk cows and a sickly calf. The barn roof sagged ominously, threatening to collapse with the next heavy snow. The wheat field, once their pride, lay half-planted. She simply didn't have the strength to work it all herself. Sarah had sold William's tools, then his horse, and finally her mother's silver tea service, but the money barely covered their most pressing needs. Mr. Jenkins from the bank had visited yesterday, his sympathy barely masking his businesslike demeanor. 3 months, Mrs. Collins, he'd said, shuffling papers with practiced detachment. The bank's been patient considering the circumstances, but we can't extend the mortgage any further. Sarah heated water for the morning's porridge, stretching, the last of their oats with dried apple slices. Emma came in, carrying fresh eggs from their remaining hens. "Only 3 today, Mama," she reported, her young face too serious. "But they're good ones." "That's wonderful, darling." Sarah managed a smile, though her heart ached. 3 eggs wouldn't feed 3 hungry mouths, but Emma needed praise for her diligence. "Would you fetch Thomas? Breakfast is nearly ready." As Emma went to call her brother, Sarah divided the porridge into 3 bowls, giving the children larger portions than her own. She'd learned to ignore her own hunger. A mother's sacrifice came as naturally as breathing. Thomas burst in, proudly, carrying a bundle of kindling he'd gathered. "Mama, look! I found some dry wood under the old oak tree." His eyes shone with the same determination William had always shown, making Sarah's heart clench with both pride and sorrow. "Well done, my brave boy." She ruffled his hair as he passed, noting how his shirt sleeves had grown too short. They'd need new clothes before winter, but that was a worry for another day. Over breakfast, Emma announced, "Mrs. Peterson at church said she'd pay me to help with her mending." She stirred her porridge thoughtfully. "I could go after my chores." Sarah's throat tightened. Her children shouldn't have to work for others at such young ages, but pride had no place in survival. "That's very kind of her, Emma. Just don't neglect your studies." Education was one thing Sarah refused to sacrifice. William had been so adamant about their children learning to read and cipher. After breakfast, Sarah watched her children head to the small schoolhouse a mile down the road. Their patched clothes and worn boots a testament to their poverty, but they walked tall, just as she taught them. Colin's children didn't slouch, no matter their circumstances. Alone in the quiet cabin, Sarah allowed herself a moment of weakness. Tears slid down her cheeks as she gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table. "Oh, William," she whispered to the empty room, "how am I supposed to do this without you?" The question echoed unanswered, as it had every day since his passing. But she had no choice but to find a way. 3 months to save their home. 3 months to perform a miracle. Sarah wiped her eyes, straightened her apron, and stepped outside to face another day of impossible choices and relentless work. Her children needed her to be strong, and strong she would remain, even if it broke her heart in the process. The storm arrived just before dusk, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the cabin's shutters. Sarah had just finished storing the day's meager harvest, 3 turnips and a handful of winter squash, when she heard Thomas shouting from outside, "Mama! Mama! Come quick!" There was an edge to his voice she'd never heard before. Sarah grabbed her shawl, hurrying out into the growing darkness. The wind whipped her skirts as she followed Thomas's voice toward the edge of their wheat field. Emma was already there, standing rigid as a fence post, staring at something in the growing shadows. "Good Lord," Sarah breathed, crossing herself. At the sight before them, a man lay crumpled in the mud, blood darkening his expensive shirt. Beside him, a magnificent black stallion lay dead, its saddle adorned with elaborate Mexican silver spurs that glinted dully in the fading light. The man's clothes spoke of wealth, fine wool coat, leather boots that cost more than their entire harvest. But wealth meant nothing when life's blood was seeping into Montana soil. "He's still breathing, Mama," Emma whispered, her face pale in the gathering dark. "We can't leave him out here." Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. They barely had enough food for themselves, barely enough medicine, barely enough of anything. But her daughter was right. They couldn't leave him to die. "Thomas, run back and stoke the fire. Emma, help me with him." Sarah knelt in the mud, checking the man's pulse. It was there, but weak, fluttering like a trapped bird beneath his skin. The stranger groaned as they turned him over. He was a large man, solid with muscle beneath his fine clothes. Blood matted his dark hair, and more seeped from a wound in his side. His face, though lined with pain, bore the refined features of someone used to commanding respect. "What do you suppose happened to him?" Emma asked, struggling to help her mother drag the unconscious man toward their cabin. "Nothing good," Sarah replied grimly, noting the powder burns around the bullet hole in his shirt. This was no hunting accident. They managed to get him inside, though Sarah's back screamed in protest. Thomas had the fire blazing, casting worried glances at the blood they were tracking across the floor. "Emma, fetch my herb box. Thomas, bring clean rags and water." Sarah's voice was steady, though her hands shook as she began cutting away the stranger's shirt. The wound was ugly, but the bullet had passed clean through. She'd seen worse during the war, when their farm had served as an informal field hospital. As she cleaned and dressed the wound, Sarah couldn't help noticing other scars on the man's body. Old bullet wounds, knife marks, the tales of a violent life written in flesh. What kind of man was she bringing into her home, near her children? But then she saw something else. A silver pocket watch, blood-stained but fine, hanging from his vest. She carefully opened it, revealing an inscription, "To J.W.H. with eternal love, Margaret." The watch's owner had been loved once, had been someone's dear one. She couldn't turn him away. Through the night they tended him. Emma proved herself invaluable, changing cold compresses and helping prepare poultices from Sarah's dwindling herb supply. Thomas kept the fire stoked and watched at the window, though for what, Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to know. The strangers. Fever rose with the moon, bringing with it delirious mumblings. "Margaret, forgive me, should have been there." His voice was cultured, despite the fever's rasp. "The papers in the saddle must—" "Hush now," Sarah soothed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You're safe here." Dawn was breaking when his fever finally broke. Sarah sent the children to bed, their young faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. She stayed by the stranger's side, watching the rise and fall of his chest, studying the strong lines of his face. Who was he? What had brought him, wounded and alone, to the edge of their failing farm? The questions tumbled through her tired mind as she kept her vigil. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, the stranger's eyes fluttered open. They were a striking blue, clear and intelligent, despite the lingering effects of fever. For a long moment he stared at Sarah, confusion giving way to understanding. "You saved my life," he said simply, his voice rough but gentle. Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance and the poverty evident in every corner of their cabin. "Rest now. Questions can wait." He caught her hand as she rose, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," he whispered, sincerity heavy in his voice. Then his eyes closed again, this time in natural sleep. Sarah watched him for a moment longer, an inexplicable feeling stirring in her chest. Somehow, she knew their lives would never be the same after this night. The next 2 days passed in a blur of fevered mutterings and anxious vigilance. Sarah sent the children to school as usual, not wanting to disrupt their routine, but she could see their minds were back at the cabin with their mysterious guest. Even at school, Emma later reported, they couldn't escape the intrigue. Thomas had found a crumpled wanted poster by the schoolhouse showing rough-looking men who'd been terrorizing nearby ranches. "Probably the same ones who shot him, Mama," Thomas whispered over dinner, his eyes wide with excitement. "Maybe he's a lawman hunting them down. Or maybe," Emma added thoughtfully, stirring her thin soup, "he's running from them." Sarah shushed them both, though the same questions had been haunting her. The stranger's expensive clothes suggested wealth, but the scars on his body spoke of violence. His fevered ramblings painted an even more complex picture. "The double H must protect." "The double H," he'd mutter, tossing restlessly. Other times, he'd call out for Margaret, the name from the pocket watch, his voice thick with grief. Then there were the troubling moments when he'd suddenly tense, hands clenching as if reaching for weapons, speaking of ambushes and betrayal. During his more lucid moments, he was unfailingly courteous, thanking Sarah for each small kindness with the manners of a gentleman. He'd even tried to refuse their precious broth, seeing how little they had. "Ma'am, I can't take food from your children's mouths." "Nonsense," Sarah had replied firmly, though her heart warmed at his consideration. A body needs strength to heal. On the third morning, while changing his bandages, Sarah noticed his fever had finally broken completely. His blue eyes were clear as they followed her movements, and there was color in his face beyond the flush of illness. "Your children," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been. "They're well behaved. You've done a fine job with them." Sarah's hand stilled for a moment. "Thank you. They're good kids. They've had to grow up too fast, though." He nodded, understanding in his gaze as he looked around their humble cabin. "Times are hard." "We manage," Sarah said, perhaps too quickly. Pride made her add, "We're not looking for charity, Mr." She let the question hang. A small smile touched his lips. "Harrison, James Harrison." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "And I would never presume to offer charity, Mrs. Collins, but I believe in paying my debts." Something in his tone made Sarah look up sharply. He held her gaze steadily, and she had the unsettling feeling he'd seen every patch in their clothes, every crack in the walls, every sign of their desperate circumstances. Before she could respond, Emma burst through the door, out of breath. "Mama! Ryder's coming!" Fear threaded through her voice, and Sarah's heart clenched. James Harrison's reaction was immediate. Gone was the invalid. In his place was a man of action, despite his wounds. "Get the children behind the root cellar door," he ordered quietly, already trying to rise. "Anyone asks, you haven't seen a soul." Sarah helped him to the back room, questions burning on her tongue. Who were these men? Why was he so certain they meant harm? But there was no time. Horses were approaching. She hurried Emma and Thomas into the root cellar, pressing a finger to her lips. Then she smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and opened the cabin door just as 3 riders pulled up. They were rough-looking men, trail dust coating their clothes, weapons worn openly on their hips. The leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, touched his hat with mock politeness. "Afternoon, ma'am. We're looking for a friend of ours. Tall fellow, well-dressed, might have passed through here recently." Sarah met his gaze steadily, channeling every bit of William's strength. "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description. We don't get many visitors out here." The man's eyes narrowed, studying her face for signs of deception. Behind him, his companions were eyeing the property with predatory interest. "Mind if we look around, just to be thorough?" "I do mind," Sarah replied, steel entering her voice. "My children are inside, and I don't allow strange men near them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She held her ground, heart pounding, until they finally turned their horses away. Only when they were dots on the horizon did she close the door and sag against it, trembling. What kind of man was she harboring, and what had she gotten her family into? That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah confronted James with a cup of willow bark tea and questions that couldn't wait until morning. He sat propped up in the bed they'd made him on the floor, looking more like himself despite the pallor of recovery. "Those men," Sarah began, keeping her voice low, "they weren't friends of yours." "No, Mum." James accepted the tea with a grateful nod. "And I thank you for not telling them about me, though it must have cost you lying." "Like that." Sarah settled into William's old chair, her fingers absently tracing the worn armrests. "What I told them wasn't exactly a lie. I haven't seen their friend, only a wounded man who needed help." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "You have a diplomatic way with words, Mrs. Collins." He reached beside him and withdrew a folded document from his coat. "I believe it's time you knew who you're harboring." The paper he handed her was a deed. Not just any deed, but one for the Double H Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the name. James William Harrison. "You own the Double H?" She'd heard of the ranch, of course. Everyone had. Its owner was known to be wealthy but reclusive, a mystery to most folks in the territory. "I do." James set down his tea, his expression growing serious. "Those men who came today, they work for Marcus Blackwood, though not officially. He's been trying to buy the Double H for years, by any means necessary." His hand drifted to his healing wound. This was his latest attempt at persuasion. Sarah's mind raced, pieces falling into place. The expensive clothes, the fine horse, the way he carried himself, it all made sense now, but one thing didn't. "Why tell me this?" "Because you and your children risked everything to save a stranger." James met her eyes steadily. "You deserve to know the truth, and to understand the risk you took. More importantly, you deserve to know I have the means to protect you from any consequences of that kindness." Sarah straightened in her chair, pride flaring. "We didn't help you expecting payment, Mr. Harrison." "James, please." His voice softened. "And I know you didn't. That's precisely why I want to help." Thomas chose that moment to appear in the doorway, sleep-tousled and clutching his father's old wooden horse. "Mama, I heard voices." Sarah rose to guide him back to bed, but James spoke first. "Come here, young man." Thomas approached cautiously, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. James reached into his coat again and produced a small carved horse, its details fine enough to show every muscle and flowing mane. "I've been working on this while I rest," James explained, handing it to Thomas. "Kept me from going stir-crazy. What do you think?" Thomas's eyes lit up as he examined the carving. "It looks just like your horse, sir. The one that—" His voice trailed off, remembering the dead stallion. "Yes, it does." James's voice held no bitterness, only gentle understanding. His name was Midnight. He was a good friend. He showed Thomas how the wooden horse's legs were jointed, allowing it to be posed. "Every good horse needs a good owner to care for it. Think you can do that?" Thomas nodded solemnly, clutching both wooden horses to his chest. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes, remembering how William used to spend evenings carving toys for the children. "Thank you, Sir James," Thomas corrected himself, beaming. "I'll take real good care of it." After Sarah had tucked Thomas back into bed, she returned to find James looking thoughtful. "He's a fine boy," he said. "Reminds me of myself at that age before—" He trailed off, pain flickering across his features. "Before what?" "Before I learned that the world isn't always kind to dreamers." James shifted, wincing slightly. "Your children still have that light in their eyes, Mrs. Collins. Despite everything, they haven't lost hope. That's a testament to your strength." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Sarah, please, if I'm to call you James." "Sarah." He smiled, and for a moment she saw past the wealthy rancher to the man beneath, one who'd known loss, who understood struggle, who recognized the value of simple kindness. "I think tomorrow I might be strong enough to show Thomas how to properly whittle, if you approve, of course." She found herself smiling back. "I think he'd like that very much." Neither of them mentioned the deed still lying between them, or the men who might return, or the growing sense that their lives were changing in ways they couldn't yet understand. For now, it was enough to share this quiet moment, warmed by the embers of trust beginning to glow between them. As James regained his strength over the next few days, Sarah noticed him watching her family with an expression she couldn't quite read. He spent mornings teaching Thomas to whittle, afternoons listening to Emma read from her schoolbooks, and evenings sharing stories of cattle drives and frontier life that had both children spellbound. But it was the quiet moments that revealed most about their mysterious guest. One afternoon, while the children were at school, Sarah found him standing at the window, holding a worn photograph she hadn't seen before. In it, a beautiful young woman smiled at the camera, her hand resting on a younger James's shoulder. "Margaret," he said quietly without turning around. "My wife." Sarah paused in her mending, hearing the weight of loss in those two words. "The one from the pocket watch inscription." He nodded, finally turning to face her. "She died 8 years ago. Fever took her and our unborn child." His fingers traced the photograph's edge. "I built the double H for her, you know. She always wanted a place where we could raise a family, grow old together." By the time it was finished, she was gone. The revelations settled in the quiet cabin like dust motes in sunlight. Sarah understood now why the wealthy owner of the double H lived alone, why his eyes sometimes held such shadows. "William, my husband, he built this cabin with his own hands," Sarah offered, sharing her own grief in return. "Said every nail was a promise of our future together." James settled into the chair across from her, his wound allowing more movement now. "How did you meet him?" "At a barn raising. He was the only one who didn't treat me like a delicate flower, because I was the preacher's daughter." Sarah smiled at the memory. "First thing he said was, 'Those hands look like they know honest work.' Smart man." He was. Sarah resumed her mending, the familiar motion soothing. "The children are so much like him. Emma has his determination, and Thomas, his gentle heart. They're extraordinary children," James agreed, watching her work. "The way they've stepped up to help their mother, never complaining about the burdens they carry, reminds me that strength comes in many forms." Sarah's hand stilled. "Sometimes I worry it's too much for them. They should be playing, not—" She gestured at their threadbare surroundings. "They play," James said softly. "I've watched them, but they also understand what matters. Family, loyalty, hard work. Those are lessons many adults never learn." Their eyes met across the cabin, and Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared understanding, of parallel griefs that had shaped them both. The moment was broken by the children's return from school, their voices carrying. Across the yard, Emma burst in first, clutching a piece of paper. "James, the teacher said my arithmetic was perfect today." "Did she now?" James's entire demeanor changed, warming like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Well, that deserves a proper celebration. How about I teach you to calculate cattle percentages? Every rancher needs to know their numbers. As Emma settled beside him at the table, Thomas, hovering nearby to listen, Sarah watched them together. James treated the children with a natural ease that spoke of the father he might have been, had life turned out differently. There was no condescension in his manner, no false praise, just genuine interest and gentle guidance. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah found James on the porch, staring at the stars. His wound was healing well, which meant he'd be leaving soon. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest. "I've been alone at the Double H for so long," he said without preamble. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to have a family around." He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in the moonlight. "Thank you for reminding me." Sarah wanted to say something about loneliness, about healing, about how his presence had brought something vital back to their home, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, understanding passing between them in the quiet night air. They stood together in comfortable silence, while somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound that echoed across the prairie and settled in their hearts. The morning James Harrison declared himself well enough to ride brought both relief and an unexpected sadness to the Collins household. He'd borrowed one of the neighbors' horses the day before, sending Thomas to arrange it, and now stood in their kitchen, looking more the wealthy rancher than the wounded man they'd nursed back to health. "Before I leave," he said, placing a thick envelope on the table, "there's something we need to discuss, Sarah." She eyed the envelope warily, her spine stiffening. "We've managed just fine before, Mr. Harrison." "James," he corrected gently. "And yes, you have managed, but at what cost?" He pulled out a chair, gesturing for her to sit. "Please, hear me out." Sarah sat, noting how Emma and Thomas hovered in the doorway, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. James noticed them too and smiled warmly. "Children, would you give your mother and me a moment?" The request was kind but firm. They retreated reluctantly, though Sarah suspected they'd be listening from just outside. James sat across from her, pushing the envelope forward. "This is a bank notice. I've settled your mortgage." Sarah's hand flew to her throat. "You had no right." "Perhaps not," he agreed, raising a hand to forestall her protest. "But I had the means and the will. The bank will no longer be threatening to take your home." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, relief warring with pride. "We can't accept." "You can, and you will." James's voice was quiet, but determined. "Not as charity, Sarah, as an investment in people who showed extraordinary kindness to a stranger." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "But that's not all I'm proposing." From his coat, he withdrew another document. "The Double H needs good people, honest people. I'm offering you a partnership of sorts." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the paper. It was a contract, carefully worded, outlining a position as manager of a new breeding operation he proposed to start on her land. "Your property sits on excellent grazing land," James explained. "With some improvements, a new barn, proper fencing, quality stock, it could be productive again. The children could continue their schooling, but also learn ranching if they're interested." He paused, watching her face. "You'd be paid a fair wage, plus a percentage of the operation's profits." Sarah stared at the contract, her mind whirling. "Why?" "Because, in the week I've spent here, I've seen more genuine strength and dignity than I've encountered in years of business dealings." James's voice softened. "Your children are bright and hard-working. You're capable and determined. The Double H would benefit from having people like you associated with it." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small key. "There's a strong box in my saddlebag. Would you ask Thomas to fetch it?" When Thomas brought the box, James opened it carefully. Inside lay banknotes and additional papers. "This is an advance on your salary, enough to make the immediate improvements the property needs. And these," he indicated the papers, "are recommendations from associates in town. The general store, the mercantile, the lumber yard. They'll extend you credit on my account for whatever supplies you require. Sarah's pride warred with practicality. The offer was more than generous. It was life-changing, but accepting help, especially on this scale. I won't be beholden to any man, she said finally, her voice firm. James smiled. I wouldn't expect you to be. This is business, Sarah, pure and simple. You'll work hard for everything you receive. He gestured to the contract. Read it carefully. Have a lawyer look it over if you wish. I'll abide by whatever decision you make. Emma's voice came from the doorway, unable to contain herself any longer. Does this mean we can fix the barn? James turned, his expression warm. If your mother agrees, yes. And maybe add a few horses for you and Thomas to learn on. Thomas appeared beside his sister, eyes wide. Real horses? Of our own? Thomas, Sarah cautioned. But James held up a hand. Let them dream a little, Sarah. His eyes met hers. Sometimes dreams are what give us the courage to accept help, when pride would rather we didn't. Sarah looked at her children's hopeful faces. Then, back at the papers before her, she thought of William, of his dreams for their family, of how he'd always said opportunity wore strange disguises. I'll need time to think about it, she said finally. James nodded, standing. Of course. I'll return in 3 days. He moved toward the door, then paused. Remember, Sarah, accepting help doesn't mean surrendering your independence. Sometimes it means choosing a different path to the same destination. After he'd gone, Sarah sat at the table for a long time, the contract before her, listening to her children's excited whispers and feeling the weight of possibility pressing against her chest like a physical thing. The architect's plans for the homestead renovation lay spread across Sarah's kitchen table, blue lines sketching out a future she was still learning to believe in. 3 weeks had passed since she'd signed James's contract, and already the property was transforming. The new barn rose quickly, its fresh-cut timber fragrant in the spring air. Local men, hearing that James Harrison of the Double H was backing the project, had appeared offering their labor. Sarah watched them work from her doorway, remembering barn raisings of the past, when William had been alive and their future had seemed so certain. It's good bones, James said, coming to stand beside her. He'd been riding out every few days to oversee the work, though Sarah suspected he had other reasons for his frequent visits. Like this whole place, just needed someone to see the potential. The town had buzzed with gossip when word spread about their arrangement. Sarah heard the whispers at church, saw the speculative glances. Some, like Mrs. Peterson, approached with genuine warmth, pleased to see the Collins family's fortunes turning. Others, like the banker's wife, watched with barely concealed disapproval at what they assumed was happening between the widow and the wealthy rancher. Let them talk, James had said when she'd mentioned it. People who have never known struggle are quick to judge those who have. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with such judgments. Emma and Thomas seemed oblivious to the gossip, too excited by each new development. The arrival of the first 2 horses, gentle, well-trained animals James had chosen specifically for them, had brought tears to their eyes. Now they spent every free moment at the corral, learning to ride under James's patient instruction. "Back straight, Thomas," he called out now, watching the boy guide his mount in careful circles. "That's it. You're a natural, son." The word son slipped out naturally, and Sarah saw Thomas sit a little straighter in the saddle. James hadn't seemed to notice what he'd said, but Sarah felt its weight. He'd been filling spaces in their lives they hadn't even realized were empty. "The foundation for the new wing will be started tomorrow," James said, consulting the plans. "Again, the children should each have their own room." Sarah traced the blue lines with her finger. "It seems like so much, James. Not compared to what you've given me." His voice was quiet, serious. When she looked up, questioning, he continued, "A reminder of what matters, why I built the Double H in the first place. It was never meant to be just about profit." A commotion from the corral interrupted them. Emma had managed her first proper trot, her face glowing with achievement. "Mama, did you see?" Well done, darling, Sarah called back, her heart full. She hadn't heard such joy in her daughter's voice since before William died. James smiled at Emma's progress, then turned back to Sarah. There's something else I've been meaning to discuss. The school board had a meeting yesterday. Sarah tensed, remembering the times she'd had to beg for understanding when she couldn't afford the children's books. I've arranged for a proper library to be built, James continued, and for a second teacher to be hired. The children in this district deserve every opportunity to learn. The whole district? Sarah asked, surprised. Not just Emma and Thomas, James shook his head. Education lifts everyone, Sarah. Your children help me remember that, watching them with their books every evening. She studied his profile, this man who'd entered their lives like a character from one of Emma's novels. Why are you really doing all this, James? He was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas and Emma with their horses. When Margaret died, I forgot something important, he said finally. I forgot that wealth without purpose is just weight in your pockets. Your family, you reminded me what it means to build something meaningful. A shout from the barn drew their attention. The workers had finished raising the main beam. Soon there would be a stable for the horses, storage for hay, a proper tack room. The architectural plans showed it all, every detail carefully considered. Progress, James said softly, satisfaction in his voice. But this is just the beginning. Sarah looked at him sharply, hearing something in his tone that suggested he meant more than just the buildings. But before she could ask, Emma called for him to watch her trot again, and he moved away, leaving Sarah to wonder about the changes taking place, not just to their property, but to their hearts. Emma's first riding saddle arrived on a Tuesday morning, the tooled leather gleaming with intricate patterns of morning glories and wild roses. She stood speechless, running her fingers over the detailed work, while James explained the craftsmanship that had gone into its making. Every good horsewoman needs her own saddle, he said, showing her how to care for the leather. This one's size just for you. The design, he paused, something flickering in his eyes. The morning glories were Margaret's favorite, seemed fitting somehow. Sarah, watching from the barn doorway, caught the significance of the gesture. He wasn't just giving Emma a saddle. He was sharing something of his past, weaving threads of his lost dreams into their new beginning. It's beautiful, Emma whispered, then surprised them all by throwing her arms around James's waist. He stood frozen for a moment before his arms came around her, his expression a mixture of joy and old pain. Well now, he said gruffly, clearing his throat, let's see how it sits on that mare of yours. The lessons that followed weren't just about riding. James taught Emma and Thomas the proper way to approach a horse, how to read its mood, how to earn its trust. Sarah found herself learning too, watching the patient way he built their confidence. Horses are like people, he explained one afternoon, as Thomas struggled to get his mount to cooperate. They know when you're nervous or unsure. You have to believe in yourself before they'll believe in you. Thomas frowned, gripping the reins too tightly. But what if I make a mistake? Then you learn from it. James adjusted the boy's hands gently. That's all any of us can do. Your father, he would have taught you these things, wouldn't he? Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He promised to teach me everything about the farm when I got bigger. He'd be proud of you now, James said quietly. Learning new things, helping your mother, being brave even when it's hard. He stepped back, gesturing to the horse. Now show me that turn again. Remember, confidence. Sarah watched her son straighten his shoulders, determination replacing uncertainty. The horse responded immediately to his more assured handling, executing a perfect turn. That's my boy, James called out, pride evident in his voice. He turned to find Sarah watching them, and something passed between them, an understanding of what these moments meant. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, she heard James and Emma on the porch, their voices carrying through the open window. Emma was asking about the Double H, about the cattle operations and breeding programs. I want to learn everything, Emma declared. Mama says girls can do anything if they set their minds to it. Your mama's a wise woman, James replied. You know, some of the best ranch managers I know are women. They have a natural way with the animals, an attention to detail that many men miss. Could I be a ranch manager someday? With hard work and learning? Absolutely. James's voice held no condescension, only genuine encouragement. Tell you what, tomorrow I'll show you how we keep the breeding records. Mathematics, genealogy, careful observation. It all matters in building a strong herd. Sarah stirred. The stew, remembering William's words about Emma, that girl's got more fire in her soul than most grown men. He would have loved seeing her like this, eyes bright with purpose, mind eager for knowledge. The screen door creaked as Thomas joined his sister and James on the porch. Soon they were deep in conversation about different horse breeds, the boys, natural curiosity drawing out James's extensive knowledge. Sarah listened to their voices, blending in the gathering dusk, her children's bright questions, James's thoughtful answers, the easy laughter they shared. This was what healing sounded like, she realized. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of new joy growing alongside cherished memories. James caught her eye through the window, and his smile held a warmth that made her heart flutter. He'd given them more than material security. He'd given them back their sense of possibility, their right to dream beyond mere survival. "Mama!" Thomas called out. "James says I can help with the new calves when they come. Real ranch work." "That's wonderful, darling," she answered, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "Now wash up for dinner, both of you." As the children clattered inside, James lingered on the porch, his expression thoughtful. "They're quick learners," he said when she joined him. "Like their mother." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "We've had a good teacher." His hand found hers in the growing darkness, a brief touch that felt as natural as breathing. "We're all learning. Together, Sarah, that's what family does." The word family hung in the air between them, full of question and promise. Summer mellowed into autumn, painting the Montana sky in rich golds and deep blues. James unrolled a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table, showing Sarah how their modest homestead had grown. New fencing stretched across expanded pastures. The renovated barn stood proud and sturdy, and the wheat field, William's pride and joy, had yielded its first abundant harvest in years. "The soil here is exceptional," James explained, his finger tracing the boundaries of their property. "With proper crop rotation and the new irrigation system, you'll see even better yields next season." Sarah studied the map, marveling at how their world had expanded. "I never thought I'd see this place thrive again. You always had the foundation for success." James's voice was warm. It just needed some support to rebuild. The harvest festival was approaching, and for the first time since William's death, Sarah felt ready to truly participate. The Collins family had always contributed in the past, but this year would be different. Their root cellar was full, their pantry stocked, and Emma had even won a ribbon at the county fair for her horsemanship. "Mrs. Peterson asked if we'd host the quilting circle next week," Sarah mentioned, smoothing her apron. "Said our new parlor addition would be perfect for it." James smiled, understanding the significance. The quilting circle was more than just sewing. It was the heart of the community's social network, where reputations were made or mended. Their inclusion marked a shift in how the town viewed their changed circumstances. "You should accept," he said. "Those women will see what I've seen all along, a family that perseveres with grace." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Emma and Thomas rode into view, their horses moving in perfect sync as they checked the fence line. James had taught them to ride as a team, explaining that ranch work required trust in your partner as much as skill with your mount. "They looked like they were born to it," Sarah said softly, watching her children through the window. "They were. It was just sleeping in their blood, waiting for the right moment to wake up." James stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. Like other things that sleep until the right moment, Sarah felt her cheeks warm, aware of his nearness. These moments had been happening more frequently, quiet conversations that held deeper meanings, casual touches that lingered just a moment too long. The town's gossip had shifted from scandal to speculation about when, not if, the wealthy rancher would make his intentions known. But James never rushed, never presumed. He was building this relationship as carefully as he'd helped them rebuild the farm, laying each stone of trust with patient deliberation. The children burst in, bringing the crisp autumn air with them. "Papa, I mean James," Thomas corrected, himself flushing. "We found 2 breaks in the north fence, but we marked them just like you showed us." The slip didn't go unnoticed. James's eyes met Sarah's briefly before he turned to Thomas. "Good work, son. Show me on the map where you found them." As Thomas eagerly pointed out the locations, Emma joined Sarah at the stove. "Mama, Mrs. Davidson at the general store said they're looking for help with bookkeeping. She remembered how good I am with numbers from when James taught me the breeding records. Do you think we'll discuss it?" Sarah promised, proud of her daughter's initiative. The idea of Emma working in town would have worried her before, but now, with their secure foundation and James's steady influence, it felt right to let her spread her wings. Later, after the children had gone to bed, James lingered by the door. "The Harvest Festival," he said. "I thought perhaps, that is, if you'd allow me to escort you and the children." Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. It was endearing to see the confident rancher stumbling over words like a shy suitor. "We'd be honored," she replied simply. His answering smile lit his entire face. "Then I'll bid you good night, Mrs. Collins." He tipped his hat, a gesture that managed to be both proper and intimate. As she watched him ride away in the gathering dusk, Sarah touched the window frame that William had crafted so long ago. The wood was smooth under her fingers, solid and dependable, like the foundation of their new life. Sometimes love built things to last beyond its own time, she realized. And sometimes it came back in new forms, when you were finally ready to embrace it. The storm came without warning, rolling across the prairie like God's own fury. Sarah stood at the window, watching lightning split the afternoon sky into jagged pieces. The air felt wrong, too green, too heavy, and the wind carried a sound she'd never heard before, a low moaning that made the horses stamp nervously in their stalls. "Mama!" Emma burst through the door, her hair wild from the wind. "James is riding in from the Double H. He says there's a twister coming." As if summoned by her words, James's horse appeared through the curtain of rain, its hooves throwing mud. As he pushed it hard toward the house, he was off its back before it fully stopped, his face grim. "Storm cellar! Now!" he ordered, his voice carrying over the wind's howl. "Thomas, help me get the horses into the barn. Emma, grab the emergency. Supplies your mother prepared." "Sarah, I'm not staying in the cellar while you and Thomas are out there," she cut him off, already moving to help Emma. A crack of lightning illuminated his face, worry warring with admiration. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but there was love in the words. "Fine, but be quick about it." They worked as one unit, no hesitation or confusion. The family's practiced emergency routine, combined with James's calm authority, made every moment count. As they led the frightened horses into the barn, Sarah glimpsed the lightning-damaged beam that would become their crisis point. Thomas spotted it too. "James, look!" He pointed at the main support, where lightning had blackened and split the wood. The whole structure groaned ominously in the wind. "Get out, now!" James pushed them toward the door, but it was too late. With a sound like rifle shots, the beam began to splinter. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. James shoved Thomas clear of danger, but the shifting beam caught his own shoulder, driving him to his knees. Sarah screamed his name, fighting against the wind to reach him. "The rope!" he gasped, pointing to the wall. "Sarah, you know what to do." She did know. They'd practiced emergency repairs, James insisting they all learn basic barn engineering. "Thomas, Emma, the support poles, just like we trained." The children moved without question, grabbing the reinforcement poles they'd stored for just such emergencies. Sarah's hands flew over the rope, creating the pulley system James had taught her. Together, they worked to brace the failing beam, the family moving like parts of a well-oiled machine. "Never thought," James grunted as he helped position the support despite his injured shoulder, "I'd be so grateful for those practice drills." "Less talking, more bracing," Sarah ordered, but she caught his proud smile through the rain streaming down their faces. The storm raged around them, but inside the barn, 4 people worked in perfect synchronization. Emma, who'd learned knots from James during their riding lessons, secured the temporary braces. Thomas, remembering everything his father had taught him about wood and everything James had added about engineering, helped calculate the angles of support. When the last brace was secured, they stood back, breathing hard, watching the reinforced beam hold against the wind's assault. The barn creaked and shuddered, but it held. "Into the house, quickly," James directed, cradling his injured arm. "That twister's still coming." They made it to the storm cellar just as the tornado touched down, its roar drowning out all other sounds. In the lamplight below ground, Sarah examined James's shoulder while the children huddled together, listening to the chaos above. "It's not dislocated," she announced with relief, her hands gentle on his skin, "but you'll have some magnificent bruises." "Worth it," he said softly, his good hand covering hers where it rested on his shoulder. "Sarah, seeing you all work together like that. We had a good teacher." She met his eyes in the dim light. "You've given us more than protection, James. You've given us the tools to protect ourselves." Emma's voice came from where she sat with Thomas. "We're not afraid, Mama. Well, not as much as we used to be. James taught us that being prepared is better than being afraid. And that family takes care of each other," Thomas added firmly. James's breath caught at the boy's words, and Sarah felt his hand tighten on hers. Above them, the storm began to fade, its fury spending itself across the prairie. They stayed in the cellar until the all-clear, talking quietly, drawing comfort from each other's presence. When they finally emerged, the barn stood solid, wounded but unbowed, like the family that had fought to save it. The lightning-scarred beam would become a reminder of this night, of how crisis had proven what they were becoming, a family bound by more than blood or circumstance, forged in challenge and strengthened by love. Sarah found James's journal by accident while helping him change his bandages after the storm. It fell from his coat pocket, leather-bound and well-worn, opening to pages filled with a neat architectural hand. She tried to look away, but a familiar name caught her eye. Margaret would have loved the Collins children. "It's all right," James said softly, noticing her discovery. "Read it if you'd like. There shouldn't be secrets between—" He paused, letting the unspoken word hang between them. Sarah sat beside him, the journal warm in her hands. His writing revealed a soul deeper than she'd imagined, pages filled with both pain and hope. He wrote of Margaret's death, of dark years wandering the Double H alone, of how an act of kindness from a struggling widow and her children had awakened something he'd thought forever lost. "I've been writing again since I met your family," he admitted, watching her read. "Margaret always said I kept my feelings too close, that I needed to let them breathe on paper." "She sounds wise," Sarah said gently, turning a page to find a sketch of Emma on horseback, Thomas working with his new tools, herself standing in the doorway of their home. "She would have adored you all." James's voice was thick with emotion. "Sometimes I think she led me here that night I was shot, her way of telling me to stop hiding from life." Sarah closed the journal carefully. "Tell me about her, the real Margaret, not just the memory." James smiled, settling back in his chair. "She loved morning glories, hence Emma's saddle design. Said they reminded her that beauty opens fresh each day." He chuckled softly. "She was terrible at cooking but wouldn't admit it, burned everything except coffee, but she could charm anyone from ranch hands to bankers." "How did you meet? At a charity auction in Denver, I was there to buy breeding stock. She was organizing the event, trying to raise money for a children's home. His eyes grew distant with memory. She convinced me to donate 3 times what I'd planned. Said if I had money to buy fancy cattle, I had money to help orphans. Sarah smiled, imagining the scene. She challenged you. Like someone else, No. His good hand found hers. Sarah, I've been wanting to tell you, these past months, watching you fight for your children, seeing your strength and grace, I never thought I'd feel this way again. James, let me finish, please. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not trying to replace William, just as you're not replacing Margaret. But I think they'd both be happy seeing us find our way to each other. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. The children adore you, and I love them as my own. He shifted to face her fully. I love their mother too, with a depth that both surprises and humbles me. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. They'd been moving toward this moment for months, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them real, irrevocable. I've been afraid, she admitted, not of loving you, but of depending on someone again, of risking loss. I know, James's thumb traced circles on her palm. We've both learned the hard way that love means risking pain, but it also means choosing joy, choosing life. He gestured to his journal. I've been writing our story, Sarah. Not just mine, but all of us. How fate or providence brought us together, how your family taught me to live again. Sarah thought of William, of his dream for their children, his hope for their future. She thought of Margaret, who had taught James to open his heart on paper. Their loves hadn't ended with death. They had transformed, becoming the foundation for something new. Read me what you've written, she asked softly. James opened the journal again, finding a recent entry. His voice was gentle as he read about Emma's first successful cattle drive, Thomas's growing skill with carpentry, the way Sarah's laugh had begun to sound free again. He wrote of healing, of second chances, of love that grew not in spite of past grief but because of it, because loss had taught them the precious nature of joy. As his words filled the quiet room, Sarah felt the last walls around her heart crumbling. They were building something beautiful here, not just on paper or on the land, but in the spaces between their hearts, in the way their broken pieces fit together to make something whole and new. The first snow fell early that year, blanketing the Collins homestead in pristine white. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching James teach the children how to read weather signs in the morning sky. Their breath frosted the air as he pointed out cloud formations, explaining how to predict storms from nature's subtle hints. This winter felt different from the last, not just because of their well-stocked barn and sturdy roof, but because of the warmth that filled their home despite the cold outside. The evidence of that warmth lay scattered throughout the house. Handmade Christmas gifts carefully hidden in dresser drawers, secret whispers between Emma and Thomas as they planned surprises, the quiet contentment in James's eyes when he thought no one was watching. The Anderson family lost their cabin in that fire last week, Emma mentioned at dinner, pushing her stew around thoughtfully. Mary Anderson said they're staying in the church basement until spring. James set down his spoon, meeting Sarah's eyes across the table. They'd already discussed taking in the Andersons, but had waited to hear what the children thought. It's awful cold in that basement, Thomas added, and they've got little ones. Sarah smiled, proud of her children's gentle hearts. What do you two think about sharing your rooms for a while? The Andersons could use our new addition until they rebuild. We'd have to move the Christmas tree, Emma calculated. But it would look nice in the front parlor anyway. And I could help Mr. Anderson with the rebuilding, Thomas offered. James has been teaching me about house frames. James cleared his throat, clearly moved by their immediate acceptance of the idea. That's settled then. I'll ride over tomorrow and make the offer. Later that evening, after the Andersons had been invited and welcomed, Sarah found James in the barn, working on something he quickly covered with a cloth. No peeking, he warned, smiling. Christmas secrets. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him work by lamplight. You've started quite a tradition, you know. The children are determined their handmade gifts must be perfect. Speaking of which, he pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. This one can't wait until Christmas. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound book filled with blank pages, its cover tooled with morning glories like Emma's saddle. I thought, James said softly, you might want to write your own story, the children's too. Memory is precious, Sarah. It should be preserved. Sarah ran her fingers over the soft leather, thinking of James's journal, of the way he'd used writing to heal. Thank you, she whispered. A commotion from the house interrupted them, the Andersons arriving with their meager belongings. Sarah and James hurried to help, watching as their children welcomed the younger Anderson kids with natural warmth. That night, with two families crowded under one roof, Sarah wrote the first entry in her new journal. Today we learned that home stretches to hold what love requires. The children gave up their rooms without hesitation, understanding instinctively what James and I have come to know, that blessings multiply when shared. The days grew shorter, but their evenings grew richer. James taught both families his mother's old Christmas songs while they made decorations from pine cones and ribbon. The Anderson children added their own traditions, paper snowflakes, Swedish prayers, stories of their grandmother's homeland. Emma and Mary Anderson became thick as thieves, spending hours together making gifts for their families. Thomas took young Billy Anderson under his wing, teaching him about tools and wood with the same patience James had shown him. The smell of Christmas baking filled the house. Sarah and Mrs. Anderson trading recipes, mixing traditions as easily as they mixed dough. Even Mr. Anderson's quiet depression began to lift as James involved him in planning the rebuild of their cabin, giving him hope to carry through the winter. One evening, Sarah found James standing in the doorway of the crowded parlor, watching their expanded family with misty eyes. Having second thoughts about taking them in? She asked softly. He shook his head, thinking about Margaret again, but differently now. He turned to Sarah, taking her hand. She always said wealth was meant to be shared, that a home should be as big as its heart. He smiled. She would have loved this chaos. William, too, Sarah agreed. He believed in neighbors helping neighbors. James pulled her closer, both of them watching as Emma taught the youngest Anderson girl to string cranberries. We're not just honoring their memories anymore, are we? We're building something new, something that belongs to all of us. Sarah leaned into his strength, feeling the truth of his words. This Christmas, with its handmade gifts and shared burdens, its blended traditions and expanded family, was teaching them all what love could build when given room to grow. The threatening letter arrived on a bright January morning, carried by a ranch hand from the Double H, who'd ridden hard through the snow. Sarah recognized Marcus Blackwood's elegant handwriting even before James's face darkened at the sight of it. The children? James asked quietly, scanning the contents. At school, Sarah replied, moving to read over his shoulder. The words made her blood run cold. Harrison, your recent domestic arrangements haven't gone unnoticed. Quite touching, how you've found yourself a ready-made family. Would be a shame if anything happened to them. The Double H could have been transferred peacefully. Now, well, even the strongest barn can burn. Consider this a final courtesy. James crumpled the paper, his knuckles white. I should have known he wouldn't let it rest. Blackwood's never been one to accept defeat gracefully. Tell me, Sarah said, laying a hand on his arm. All of it this time. James sank into a chair, suddenly looking weary. Marcus Blackwood and I were partners once, years ago. He helped finance the Double H's early days when banks wouldn't touch a young rancher's dreams, but his vision was different from mine. How? So, he wanted to build an empire, squeeze out smaller ranches, control the whole territory. I wanted to create something sustainable, something that would help the community grow. James's jaw tightened. When I bought him out, he didn't take it well. started acquiring land around the Double H, trying to choke us off from water rights. Grazing lands. The night you were shot. His men, James confirmed. They'd been pressuring other ranchers to sell. I'd gathered evidence, was taking it to the territorial authorities. They tried to stop me. His eyes met Sarah's. I never meant to bring this danger to your door. Sarah straightened, William's strength flowing through her. Our door, she corrected firmly. We face things together now. Sarah, no, she cut him off. You've given us back our future, James. Helped us build something beautiful here. We won't let fear steal that from us. A horse's whinny broke the tension. Through the window, they saw Thomas and Emma returning early from school, accompanied by the sheriff. James Harrison, Sheriff Miller called out as they approached, got word of suspicious men watching the school. Thought it best to escort your young ones home. James's face hardened as he helped Emma down from her horse. Did you recognize any of them? No, sir, Emma answered, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. But they had horses like the ones those men rode last summer when they came looking. For you, Thomas stood close to James, unconsciously mimicking his protective stance. I saw them behind the mercantile too, watching us when we were shopping with Mama yesterday. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. They'd been watched, studied, their routines observed. James must have felt it too, because he turned to the sheriff with grim determination. John, I think it's time we discussed Blackwood's operations in detail. I have documentation you should see. The evidence you were carrying that night? The sheriff's hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. James nodded. And more I've gathered since. Sarah's property deed, the threats to other ranchers, details of his strong-arm tactics. He glanced at the family. But first, we need to secure the homestead. The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. James and the sheriff organized armed patrols of trusted men. Sarah and the children brought the horses into the barn, secured windows, and prepared emergency supplies just as they had before the storm. We've practiced for this too, Emma reminded Thomas as they filled water barrels. Remember what James taught us. Being prepared beats being afraid. Sarah overheard the exchange and felt fierce pride surge through her chest. Her children had grown so much, learning not just ranching skills from James, but courage and clear thinking in the face of danger. That evening, after the sheriff had left with James's evidence and extra patrols were in place, the family gathered close in the parlor. The Andersons had insisted on staying despite the threat, Mr. Anderson stating firmly that neighbors stand together. James held Sarah's hand tightly as they discussed plans for the coming days. No one spoke of fear, though it hung in the air like wood smoke. Instead, they talked of practical matters, guard rotations, supply checks, signals between houses. Whatever comes, James said finally, looking at each beloved face in turn, we face it as a family. And in that moment, watching her children's brave faces in the firelight, Sarah knew they would prevail. Love had built this family. Fear would not tear it apart. The attack came 3 nights later, during the darkest hour before dawn. Sarah woke to the smell of smoke and James's urgent voice. They've set the far pasture on fire. They're trying to draw us out. The family moved with practiced precision. No panic, no wasted motion. Emma and Thomas helped the Anderson children into the storm cellar while their parents joined the bucket line. James's wound from the storm had barely healed, but he worked tirelessly, directing men, coordinating their defense. They're coming from the North Ridge. Sheriff Miller's voice carried over the chaos. At least 8 riders. Sarah's heart clenched as she saw James check his gun, his face set in grim lines. Stay with the children, he told her. But she caught his arm. Your wound, I'll be fine. He kissed her quickly, fiercely. Keep them safe. But as he turned to leave, Emma's voice rang out from behind them. Riders coming from the south too, through the winter wheat. James spun, realizing they were being flanked. Sarah saw the moment his tactical mind shifted, analyzing their position. They'd prepared for an attack, but not from 2 directions. The barn. he decided. "Everyone inside. It's the strongest building we have." They rushed to comply, shepherding children and adults alike into the fortified structure. James's improvements had made it as solid as a fortress, with clear lines of sight and defensive positions. As Sarah helped Mrs. Anderson with the youngest children, she heard James and the sheriff organizing their defense. "Thomas," James called, "remember where we stored the extra ammunition?" "Yes, sir, behind the loose board in the tack room." "Good lad. Emma, your mother's rifle?" "Already got it, James." Emma appeared with Sarah's Winchester, her young face determined. "And I remember what you taught me about loading it." Sarah felt a surge of pride through her fear. Her children were scared, yes, but they were their father's children, and now James's too. They knew what needed to be done. The first shots came as a warning, pinging off the barn's metal roof. "They want to scare us out," James explained, positioning defenders at strategic points. "Blackwood prefers to avoid outright murder. Bad for business." "Then what do they want?" Mr. Anderson asked, cradling his youngest. "A show of force, to prove we're helpless without Double H protection." James's voice hardened. "But we're not helpless." As if to underscore his point, Emma called out, "Mama, they're moving the fire closer to the house." Sarah met James's eyes across the barn. Their home, everything they'd built together, stood vulnerable. But before either could speak, Thomas stepped forward. "The irrigation system," he said firmly. "The one James designed. We can flood the north field from here." James's face lit with fierce pride. "The control lever there in the barn wall. Sarah, your boy's a genius." "Our boy," she corrected softly, watching Thomas and James work the irrigation controls together. Water began gushing across the north field, creating a barrier between the fire and the house. But their success was short-lived. A bullet splintered the barn door, and suddenly the night erupted in gunfire. "Stay down!" James ordered, returning. Fire through a defensive port. But as he turned, Sarah saw him stumble, his old wound reopening under the strain. "James!" She rushed to him, pressing her hand against the growing bloodstain on his shirt. "It's nothing," he tried to assure her, but his face was pale with pain. "Papa's hurt," Thomas cried out, forgetting himself in his fear. The word hung in the air for a moment, even amid the chaos. James's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with pain. "I'm all right, son," he said hoarsely. "We all will be." As if in answer to his words, a new sound cut through the night. Horses, approaching at a gallop, many of them. Sheriff Miller risked a look through the window. "It's the Double H hands," he shouted. "Must be 20 of them, coming in from the east." The ranch hands' arrival turned the tide. Caught between law enforcement and loyal Double H men, Blackwood's forces quickly retreated. As the gunfire faded, Sarah helped James to his feet, supporting him as they emerged from the barn. Their home still stood, thanks to Thomas's quick thinking. The fire was contained, and the arriving ranch hands were already helping to extinguish it completely. But it was the scene inside the barn that struck Sarah most deeply. Their two families huddled together, her children showing the younger ones how to be brave, everyone supporting each other through the crisis. James leaned heavily on her shoulder, watching the same scene. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for bringing this danger." "Stop!" Sarah turned to face him. "You heard Thomas. You're his papa now. Our children chose you, James Harrison, and so did I. Whatever comes, we face it together." Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the snow-covered land in shades of pink and gold. Their world had changed in the night, but they had emerged stronger, their bonds tested by fire and fear, and found unbreakable. In the quiet days following the attack, healing took many forms. James's physical wound mended slowly under Sarah's careful attention, but it was the deeper healing within the family that proved most profound. The children were the first to broach the subject that hung in the air. Emma and Thomas stood in the doorway of James's recovery room, clutching something behind their backs. "Papa," Emma said softly, testing the word that Thomas had cried out in fear. "We made you something." James's breath caught at the title. his eyes meeting Sarah's where she sat beside his bed. She nodded encouragingly, her heart full. The children brought forward a handmade wooden box, its lid carved with morning glories like those on Emma's saddle. Inside lay a ring, a simple gold band that Sarah recognized with a start. "It was Dad's," Thomas explained, his voice quiet, but steady. "We found it in Mama's cedar chest. We thought maybe it was time it had a new purpose." James sat up straighter, emotion clear on his face. "Children, I couldn't—" "Dad would want you to have it," Emma interrupted. "He always said love was about protecting family. That's what you did. What you do." Sarah moved to sit on the bed beside James, taking his hand. "They're right," she said softly. "William would approve of the man who's helped raise his children, who's taught them strength and courage and love." James looked at the ring, then at the faces of his family, for they were truly his family now, bound by choice and love and shared trials. "I'd be honored," he said hoarsely, "but only if your mother agrees to make it official." He turned to Sarah, his eyes full of meaning. "I should be on one knee for this, but you're exactly where you should be," Sarah answered, tears threatening. "Surrounded by our children, in our home, asking a question we've all known the answer to. For months." Thomas bounced on his toes. "So you'll marry him, Mama?" "Yes," Sarah laughed, wiping her eyes. "Yes, I'll marry him." Emma carefully placed William's ring in James's palm. As he slipped it onto Sarah's finger, she felt the weight of past and present combining, not replacing old love, but building something new from its foundation. Later that evening, as the children shared the news with the Andersons, who had insisted on staying until James was fully recovered, Sarah found herself alone with her fiancé. "I've been thinking," James said, his voice thoughtful, "about names and legacies." "Oh, the Double H. It was named for Harrison, but maybe it's time for a change. The Circle C, perhaps. For Collins?" Sarah touched his face gently. "The children carry the Collins name proudly. But maybe we need something new, something that represents all of us." James caught her hand, kissing her palm. "What did you have in mind?" "The Morning Glory Ranch," she suggested. "For Margaret's flowers, for new beginnings, for beauty that opens fresh each day." His eyes grew misty. "Trust you to find the perfect way to honor both our pasts while building our future." He shifted carefully, mindful of his healing wound. "I've been working on something else too. Had planned to wait, but..." He reached for his journal, opening it to a marked page. Inside lay adoption papers, already drawn up, waiting only for signatures. "If the children want," he said softly. "They'll always be Collins by blood, but they could be Harrisons too. A fresh start for all of us." Sarah read through tears as James explained his plan, how the children could choose to keep Collins as a middle name, honoring their father while adding Harrison to mark their new chapter. How he'd already discussed it with the town lawyer, ensuring everything would be legal and proper. "We'll ask them together," she decided, "when you're stronger." A knock at the door interrupted them. Emma carrying James's evening medicine. Sarah watched as their daughter fussed over him with gentle competence, adjusting his pillows, checking his bandage just as she'd been taught. "Emma," James said, as she turned to leave, "would you and Thomas join us for a moment? There's something we'd like to discuss." Sarah held his hand as they presented the adoption option to the children. The joy on their faces, the completeness of their acceptance, was all the answer they needed. That night, writing in her journal, Sarah reflected on how love transformed. William's ring now carried new promises. Margaret's flowers bloomed in their future ranch's name, and their children would carry both their past and their future in their very names. A family bridging what was and what would be, stronger for having been tested by fire. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and wedding preparations. The morning glory vines Emma had planted around the porch posts were just beginning to sprout, promising summer blooms for their newly named ranch. The whole community had embraced the upcoming celebration, seeing it as a symbol of hope after the darkness of winter's trials. Sarah stood still as Mrs. Peterson adjusted her wedding dress, her mother's gown, carefully altered to fit both her figure and the times. Emma watched the process with shining eyes, her own new dress laid out on the bed. "Something borrowed," Mrs. Peterson said, pinning a delicate lace collar. "This was my grandmother's, brought all the way from Boston. And something blue," Emma added, bringing forward a sapphire brooch. "James had it made to match his eyes," she grinned. "He said to tell you it's also something new." Sarah touched the jewel gently. "And something old?" "That would be me," came a gravelly voice from the doorway. Reverend Matthews, who had married Sarah and William all those years ago, stood leaning on his cane. "Though I suspect I'm not quite what the tradition had in mind." The old minister had insisted on performing the ceremony despite his failing health. "Married you to your first love," he'd said to Sarah. "Only fitting I should marry you to your second. The good Lord knows the heart can grow to hold more love." The days leading up to the wedding transformed their homestead. The barn, once a fortress against danger, became a flower-filled reception hall. The Andersons, now settled in their rebuilt cabin, helped string lanterns from the rafters. Thomas proved himself an expert at directing the decorating crews, his natural talent for organization shining through. James, for his part, seemed to have his own surprises in store. Mysterious packages arrived from Denver, and he spent long hours in private conversation with Emma, who guarded their secrets with diplomatic skill. "You'll see, Mama," was all she would say, her eyes twinkling with shared conspiracy. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm. Sarah woke to find a gift on her pillow, a framed family portrait, the first they'd taken together. She and James sat in the center, the children standing behind them, all four faces glowing with happiness. The frame was carved with morning glories and wheat stalks, combining both their pasts into their shared future. A note in James's hand read, "Our first official family portrait, though you've been in my heart far longer. Today we make it legal, my love." The ceremony itself was everything Sarah hadn't known she wanted. Simple yet profound, intimate yet shared with their whole community. Emma and Thomas stood up with them, not just as children, but as vital parts of the family being joined. When it came time for the vows, James surprised them all by turning first to the children. "Before I make my promises to your mother," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "I have promises for you." He withdrew 2 small boxes. "These are pocket watches, like the one that brought me to your door that stormy night. They're engraved with your new names, the ones you chose, honoring both your fathers." Emma opened hers with trembling fingers, reading aloud, "Emma Collins, Harrison, beloved daughter." Thomas's voice joined hers. "Thomas Collins Harrison, cherished son." James continued, his eyes bright. "I promise to carry you in my heart as my own, to honor the memory of the good man who gave you life, and to spend every day trying to be worthy of the title you've given me. Papa." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering as James then turned to Sarah, taking her hands in his. "And to you, my love, I promise partnership in all things, to build our morning glory ranch together, to raise our children in love and wisdom, to face whatever storms may come with the same courage you showed on that first night when you took in a wounded stranger and changed all our lives forever." Sarah's response came from her heart, unrehearsed but true. "I promise to continue building this beautiful life with you, to blend our family's legacies into something new and wonderful, and to face each dawn grateful for the love that brought us together." Reverend Matthews beamed as he pronounced them husband and wife. As James kissed her, Sarah heard Emma whisper to Thomas, "Now we're officially Harrisons too." The celebration that followed was a true community affair. Tables groaned with potluck. Dishes, children played between the lantern-lit trees, and even the most proper ladies found themselves joining in when the dancing started, looking around at their transformed barn, at their children dancing with the Anderson kids, at James's face glowing with joy as he watched it all. Sarah felt the rightness of their journey. They had built this happiness together, brick by brick, choice by choice, love by love. The morning glories might not be blooming yet, but their promise was there in every green shoot reaching for the sun. New life, new beginnings, new beauty opening fresh each day. 1 year later, Sarah sat in the parlor of the Morning Glory Ranch, recording the day's events in the leather-bound journal James had given her. Through the window, morning glories bloomed in vibrant purple and blue, their vines strong and established now, just like the family they represented. The new family Bible lay open beside her, its pages recording their joined lives, the children's adoption, the wedding, and now her hand strayed to her growing belly. The newest Harrison, due to arrive with the spring thaw. Emma's voice drifted in from outside, confident and clear, as she directed the ranch hands in moving cattle to the north pasture. At 15, she'd grown into her role as James's apprentice, showing a natural talent for ranch management that made her father beam with pride. "She's got both our heads for business," James had said recently, watching Emma calculate breeding records, "and both our hearts for the land." Thomas, now 12, had found his own path, combining William's gift for woodworking with James's engineering mind. The elegant cradle taking shape in his workshop proved how well those inherited talents blended. Sarah smiled, remembering the morning Thomas had presented his design plans, explaining how he'd incorporated elements from both families. Morning glories carved along the rails, wheat stalks in the headboard, all supported by the solid craftsmanship William had taught him to value. "The baby should know where they come from," he'd said seriously, "all the parts that made us who we are." A commotion from the yard drew Sarah to the window. James was returning from the Double H headquarters, where Blackwood's trial had finally concluded. The children rushed to meet him, and even from a distance, Sarah could read the good news in his bearing. "Guilty on all counts," he announced as she joined them. "The evidence was too strong to ignore. Blackwood's empire is finished." Emma hugged him fiercely. "Does this mean the Morning Glory Ranch is safe?" "Safe and growing," James confirmed, drawing Sarah into their embrace. "The territory judge granted us the water rights Blackwood had. Tried to steal. We can expand the breeding program like we planned." Thomas looked up from the family cluster. "Then we can help more families, like we helped the Andersons." "That's right, son." James ruffled his hair. "The Morning Glory Ranch will be a place that grows more than just cattle. It'll grow hope." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah and James sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of the flowers that had become their symbol. "I found something today," James said, pulling a worn envelope from his vest, while going through the last of the trial documents. It was the threatening letter Blackwood had sent a year ago, its words now powerless to inspire fear. Sarah read it again, remembering the terror of that time, the way it had forged them into something stronger. "We've come so far," she murmured, leaning into her husband's strength. "We have." James's hand covered hers where it rested on her growing belly. "Sometimes I think about that night, bleeding in your wheat field. How close I came to never knowing this happiness." "God had other plans," Sarah said softly, "for all of us." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their ranch. A cow lowed in the distance, horses shuffled in the barn, and somewhere an owl called to its mate. All the ordinary precious sounds of a life built with love. "I added something to the Bible today," James said eventually. "Been meaning to for a while." Sarah followed him inside, where he opened the family Bible to a new page. There in his neat hand he'd written, "Let it be known that love builds bridges across loss, that family is formed by choice as much as blood, and that hope, like morning glories, blooms fresh each day." The Harrison family, born from the Collins and Harrison lines, stands as testament to God's grace in giving second chances and new beginnings. Written this day, in gratitude for the night a poor widow and her kids saved a dying cowboy, not knowing he would be God's answer to their prayers, just as they were the answer to his. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she read. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Our story should be preserved," James said, holding her close. "So our children and their children will know that love can heal any wound, build any bridge, transform any life. They should know they come from people who chose love over fear, hope over despair, and found their happy ending by believing in new beginnings." Sarah touched the words on the page, then reached up to touch her husband's face. Outside, the evening star shone bright over the Morning Glory Ranch, blessing the home and family that had grown from one simple act of kindness on a stormy Montana night.